sifiwe Kenya. Here Iguazu Atonia kadenewa anake. Akasusa mekia makadira. Anake makarogera jesone que odera inahane todo emoyo.
Former First Secretary at the Venezuelan Embassy Dwight Sagaray, Ahmed Mutivani Omindo, Alex Sifuna Wanyonyi, and Moses Kiprotich Kalia are guilty of planning and executing the murder of former Venezuelan ambassador to Kenya, Olga Fonseca, who was found strangled in her official residence in Runda area of Nairobi in July 2012.
Nairobi, Kenya, late July 2012. Behind high walls and electric fences in the exclusive suburb of Runda, diplomats live in secrecy and luxury. On July 27th, that peace shattered. Police entered a lavish Venezuelan embassy residence and found the acting ambassador dead, strangled. Her name, Olga Fonseca Giménez. She had been in Kenya for just 12 days. Sent to fix a broken embassy, she became its victim. The suspects, people who worked beside her every single day, fellow diplomats and Kenyan staff. A brutal power struggle turned deadly. Justice took over 11 years. This is the story of betrayal behind diplomatic walls, a murder that exposed hidden rivalries, and a trial that shocked two nations. If you're fascinated by true crimes, unsolved mysteries, and the investigations that changed history, subscribe to Dark Echoes and turn on notifications so you can never miss a new documentary.
Every silence has a story.
To understand what happened to Olga Fonseca, you have to understand what she was walking into. By the summer of 2012, the Venezuelan embassy in Nairobi was already a troubled posting. The man in charge, Ambassador Geraldo Carrillo Silva, had left his post under a cloud, accused by embassy staff of sexual harassment. Multiple local employees had filed complaints against him with Kenyan's diplomatic police unit. It was an ugly, unresolved situation, and it left the mission essentially leaderless. Into that vacuum stepped Dwight Sagaray, the embassy's first secretary. As the senior remaining official, Sagaray took over as acting head of commission. For a period, he ran the embassy day to day. Its finances, its staffs, its relationship with the Kenyan government. By most accounts, he settled comfortably into the role. Caracas, however, had different plans. Venezuelan's foreign ministry decided the Nairobi mission needed a formal fix, not a temporary caretaker. They dispatched Olga Fonseca, a career diplomat who had spent years working inside the foreign ministry, to take over as charge d'affaires and acting ambassador. It was to clean up the mess Carrillo Silva had left behind and to formally reassert Caracas' control post that had been drifting. Fonseca arrived in Nairobi and reported to the embassy in July 15, 2012. She did not waste time. According to testimony given later in court, one of Fonseca's first priorities was addressing the harassment complaints against her predecessor, and staff would later allege she wanted the local employees who filed those complaints to withdraw them. She held a meeting with an embassy employee and had her own lawyer, insisting that workers who wouldn't comply would be fired for insubordination. Her lawyer pushed back, pointing out the workers had contracts and legal protections. Fonseca reportedly said she'd take the matter up with the foreign ministry back in Caracas. At the same time, she began making other changes around the residence and the mission. New drivers, new domestic staff, new arrangements for the building itself. Small things on the surface, but in the workplace already strained by scandal and uncertainty, Each change landed like a provocation. And there was a bigger problem simmering underneath all of it. Dwight Sagaray. Sagaray had been the man running the show. Now he wasn't. According to the case that would later eventually be built against him, he deeply resented Fonseca's arrival. He had wanted to continue overseeing the embassy himself, and her appointment took that authority away. Investigators would later conclude that Sagaray actively tried to interfere with Fonseca's efforts to formally take control of the mission, resisting the handover according to court findings from the moment she arrived. It was, in essence, a workplace power struggle, except this particular workplace held diplomatic status, sovereign immunity, and, as it will turn out, deadly stakes. It is worth pausing here to think about what an embassy actually is, structurally, because it explains a lot about how this situation could curdle the way it did. An embassy isn't really a normal workplace. It's a small sovereign outpost for a foreign country operating under its own rules, largely insulated from the laws of the host nation for anything connected to official business. The ambassador, or in Fonseca's case, they're the personal representative of their home government, with authority that in some ways more closely resembles a ship's captain than a corporate executive. Decisions about staffing, about who stays and who goes, about how the mission conducts itself, ran almost entirely through that one office. Which means that when Caracas sent Olga Fonseca to take that office away from Dwight Sagaray, it wasn't a modest management shuffle. It was, from where Sagaray reportedly sat, the loss of near total authority over the one professional domain he controlled. He had been the man answering to no one in Nairobi for months. Now there would be someone standing directly above him again, and was, from his perspective, someone sent specifically to review and potentially undo the way he'd been running things. Layer onto that the embassy's very real staffing crisis. The harassment allegations against the previous ambassador weren't a minor footnote. They were serious enough that multiple Kenyan employees had gone through the diplomatic police unit to file formal complaints. That's not something staff do lightly, especially against a foreign official with immunity protections. It suggests the working environment inside that embassy had already deteriorated significantly before Fonseca ever set foot in Kenya. She wasn't inheriting a stable institution with one personal charge to make. She was inheriting an institution in crisis, one where loyalties were already fractured between those who'd sided with Carrillo Silva, those who filed complaints against him, and Sagaray, who had been running the show throughout. Into that fractured environment, Fonseca brought exactly the kind of decisive, reform-minded energy you would expect from someone sent to fix a broken posting. And decisive reform mindset energy in a workplace already with tense doesn't always land as reform. To some of the people already there, it can land as a threat. By the third week of July, people close to Fonseca say she was frightened. According to later newspaper reporting, on the night before she died, Fonseca spent her final hours at her Runda residence with close friends. She told them she had received threats on her life. She didn't specify exactly who she believed was threatening her, but she was clearly unsettled enough to voice her fear out loud to people she trusted on what would turn out to be the last night of her life. The next day, July 26th, into the early hours of July 27th, 2012, Olga Fonseca was murdered in her own home. Kenyan police pieced together a timeline in the investigations that followed. A former police officer who would later become one of the accused, Moses Kiprotich Kalia, gave a confession statement describing meetings that night with two other men. One of them, prosecutors alleged, driving a vehicle bearing diplomatic registration plates. According to that confession, Money was handed out to several men on foot that same night. And according to the same statement, one of the men involved had complained bitterly about Fonseca before the killing, grumbling in essence that the new arrival was appending how things had always been done at the embassy. New drivers, new staffs, new expectations, all imposed by one person the old guard didn't respect. The next morning, Nairobi Police Chief at the time, Anthony Kibuchi, confirmed what neighbors and embassy staff had begun to fear. Fonseca had been strangled to death. Her body was found at her official residence. Police said the killing had occurred that Friday morning and investigators were called in to begin working the scene while her body still lay in the house. Think about the practical mechanics of that scene for a moment. A diplomatic residence isn't an ordinary crime scene. It sits legally on a kind of hybrid ground, physically inside Kenya but treated under international law as connected to the sending states in ways that complicated even basic police procedures. Investigators had to move carefully, aware that missteps in how evidence was gathered inside an official residence would later be challenged on jurisdictional grounds, quite apart from the ordinary evidentiary challenges any murder case presents. And they had to do all of that while the story was already breaking internationally, with Venezuela's officials, Kenyan officials, and foreign press all covering on the same set of facts within hours. What spread fast? This wasn't a random break-in or a street crime. This was the acting ambassador of a foreign nation killed inside her own diplomatically protected residence. Less than 2 weeks into the job, it became almost instantly an international story, one that put Kenya's law enforcement, the Venezuelan government, and the machinery of diplomatic protocol all under a spotlight at once. Murders involving diplomats are rare for a reason. Diplomatic status complicates almost everything about how they're investigated. Under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the treaty that governs how nations protect each other's diplomats abroad, accredited diplomatic staff generally cannot be arrested, detained, or prosecuted by the host country unless their home government formally waivers that immunity. It's a rule designed to let the diplomats do their job without fear of politically motivated harassment or persecution in the country where they are posted. It also means that when a diplomat is the victim of a crime, or as investigators in this case increasingly suspected, when a diplomat might be the perpetrator, the normal machinery of justice doesn't simply kick in. Someone has to formally clear the way first. Kenyan investigators moved quickly regardless. Within days, First Secretary Dwight Sagaray was in custody, publicly denying any involvement in Fonseca's death. He appeared in court, though he wasn't immediately required to enter a plea while the legal questions around his status were sorted out. Kenyan media at the time reported that the person who killed Fonseca was likely someone who she knew well, a detail that pointed investigators away from a random burglary and squarely towards someone inside her own orbit at the embassy. Over the following months, the case widened. Kenyan police arrested additional suspects. First, 3 more men, then further arrests, still eventually building a group of accused that included a General Service Unit officer, a former police officer, and other Kenyans national alleged to have taken part in planning or carrying out the killing. Sagaray, meanwhile, was denied bail by Nairobi's High Court that October, a sign that prosecutors believed they had a strong enough case to keep him detained pending trial. Behind the scenes, the diplomatic complications Fonseca's death had triggered were still being worked out. Prosecuting a foreign diplomat for murder on Kenyan soil required Venezuela cooperation, specifically a waiver of whatever immunity Sagaray held in this role of the embassy. That process, layered on top of an already complex multiple defendant murder case, would help set the stage for what became one of the longest running criminal trials in recent Kenya's history. Now, here is where the story becomes less about a single violent night and more about the sheer grinding slowness of a justice system trying to process an extraordinary case. The trial of Dwight Sagaray and his co-accused stretched on for more than a decade after Olga Fonseca's death. Witnesses were called, cross-examined, and recalled. Evidence was gathered, challenged, and re-examined. Over the life of the case, the court heard from roughly 36 witnesses, the vast majority of them embassy employees who had worked alongside both Fonseca and Sagaray, and who were in the position to describe the tension inside the mission in the weeks before her death. Presiding over it all was Justice Roselyn Korir of Kenya's High Court, who inherited a case that had already dragged on for years by the time it reached her courtroom for final judgment. When she eventually delivered her ruling, she made a point of addressing the delay directly, acknowledging that the trial had taken far longer than anyone would have wanted, but insisting that the seriousness of the crime still warranted the full weight of custodial sentence whenever the judgment finally arrived. 5 defendants stood accused in total. 4 of them, Dwight Sagaray, Ahmed Mutiven Ominda, Alex Sifuna Wanyonyi, Moses Kiprotich Kelia, would ultimately be found guilty. The 5th, a man named Kipngeno Kirui Chelogoi, who worked as a security guard at the neighboring Turkish embassy, was acquitted. As it turned out, came down to something almost incidental. Prosecutors had struggled to place him inside the actual conspiracy. His connection to the case, as it turned out, came down to something almost incidental. He'd picked up a mobile phone he found lying on the road, a phone that happened to belong to Fonseca. The court accepted his explanation that he had no real relationship with the other accused and let him go. There was also a 6th figure in this story who was never brought to justice at all. A separate suspect connected to the killing fled Kenya in the aftermath of the murder and was never apprehended. Kenyan courts kept a warrant out for his arrest, but as of the case's resolution, he remained at large, a loose thread in an otherwise closed case. On January 25, 2023, nearly 11 years after Olga was found dead in her Runda residence, Justice Roselyn Korir delivered her ruling. She found out that Dwight Sagaray had resented Fonseca from the moment she arrived, that he had actively resisted her efforts to take over the mission he'd been running in her absence. In the court's assessment, Sagaray stood to be the primary beneficiary of Fonseca's death. With her out of the way, he could resume control of the embassy he believed should have remained his. The judge found that Sagaray and his 3 Kenyan co-defendants had acted together, that this wasn't the work of one man alone, but a coordinated plan involving multiple people who each played a role, whether in the planning, the logistics, or the killing itself. Korir described the witness testimony she'd had as consistent and believable. Ordinary embassy staff, she noted, who had no evident stake in favoring one side of the case over the other, simply describing what they had seen and experienced working inside a mission under strain. The court convicted all 4 men, Dwight Sagaray, Ahmed Mutiven Omindo, Alex Sifuna Wanyonyi, and Moses Kiprotich Kelia. Sentencing came short after. Each of the 4 convicted men received 20 years in prison, with the sentence calculated as running from the date of the conviction in January 2023, not from the date of the original arrest. For a case that had already consumed 11 years of legal proceedings, that detail mattered enormously. It meant that, in practical terms, none of the years spent moving through courtrooms, hearings, and appeals over the preceding decade counted towards the time each man would ultimately serve. For Venezuela's diplomatic corps and for Fonseca family and colleagues, the verdict closed after more than a decade. the central legal question of who was responsible, but it didn't end the case entirely. The 4 sentences, 20 years each, placed this case among the most severe outcomes available under Kenyan law, short of the harshest penalty reserved for the most extreme circumstances. And the decision to have those sentences run from the date of conviction rather than from the original arrest over a decade earlier meant that, practically speaking, none of the men would see any of the 11 years already spent moving through the legal process courts against their time. Dwight Sagaray did not accept the verdict quietly. Following his sentencing, Sagaray filed an appeal seeking to overturn his conviction. His argument centered not on the facts of the case, not on where he was that night or what witnesses said they saw, but on a much narrower technical question: had the waiver of his diplomatic immunity ever actually been obtained properly in the first place? It was, in a way, a return to the very issue that had complicated this case from its early days. Sagaray's legal team invoked the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations directly, arguing that the protections it afforded diplomats hadn't been correctly lifted before Kenya's authority proceeded against him, and that, as a result, the entire prosecution may have been built on unstable legal grounds, regardless of what the evidence shows about the night Olga Fonseca died. It's a reminder of just how unusual this case was from the start. For a case that began in so much uncertainty, a diplomat dead in her own home, an entirely foreign mission under suspicion, a legal question so unusual that most of Kenya's court had never had to confront anything quite like it. It ended, finally, the way most murder cases eventually do, with a judge, a courtroom, and a ruling that took far too long to arrive, but arrived all the same.